The morning sun cast long shadows across the hospital parking lot as Charles sat in his car, gripping the steering wheel with white knuckles. He had been sitting there for 20 minutes, unable to move, unable to think clearly. The phone call from Dr. Martinez still echoed in his ears like a broken record. Stage 4, terminal. 6 months, maybe less. Margaret was inside that building, probably wondering where he had gone. She had sent him to get coffee from the cafeteria, but he couldn't bring himself to go back up to room 314. Not yet. Not when he had to pretend everything was going to be okay when the doctor had just shattered their world into a million pieces. They had been married for 38 years. 38 years of sharing morning coffee, arguing about what to watch on television and falling asleep to the sound of each other's breathing. Margaret was only 62. This wasn't supposed to happen. Not to her. Not to them. Charles remembered the day he first noticed something was wrong. Margaret had been gardening, her favorite summer activity, when she suddenly dropped her watering can and sat down hard on the garden bench. When he asked if she was okay, she just smiled that smile he had fallen in love with decades ago and said she was tired. But Charles knew his wife. Margaret never got tired when she was in her garden. The symptoms started small. A persistent cough she blamed on allergies. Weight loss she attributed to finally getting serious about her health. Fatigue she explained away with jokes about getting old. Charles wanted to believe her explanations because believing them was easier than facing the alternative. But when Margaret started having trouble breathing during their evening walks around the neighborhood, Charles insisted on seeing a doctor. She had protested, saying it was just her asthma acting up. But Charles had learned to recognize the fear hiding behind her reassuring words. They had scheduled the appointment for the following week. That week felt like the longest of Charles's life. Every cough from Margaret made his heart race. Every time she paused to catch her breath, he felt like the ground was shifting beneath his feet. They had both known something was seriously wrong, but neither wanted to say it out loud. Speaking their fears would make them real. Dr. Martinez had been kind but direct. The X-rays showed masses in both lungs. They needed more tests, a CT scan, a biopsy, blood work. The medical terminology flew over Charles's head, but the worried expression on the doctor's face told him everything he needed to know. Margaret had held his hand throughout every test, every appointment, every waiting room conversation. She was the strong one, reassuring him that everything would work out fine. She made jokes with the nurses and remembered the names of the technicians. She brought homemade cookies to the oncology staff and asked about their families. That was Margaret, always thinking about everyone else, even when facing her own mortality. The biopsy results came back on a Thursday. Charles remembered because Margaret had been excited about their Thursday tradition of trying a new restaurant for lunch. They never made it to lunch that day. Instead, they sat in Dr. Martinez's office, holding hands while he explained words like metastasis and palliative care. Margaret had asked practical questions. How long? What were their options? What should they expect? Charles sat there in stunned silence, watching his wife handle the worst news of their lives with a grace and strength that made him proud and heartbroken at the same time. On the drive home from that appointment, they sat in silence for most of the 20-minute journey. Margaret finally spoke when they pulled into their driveway. She wanted to see their grandchildren as much as possible. She wanted to finish the photo albums she had been working on for years. She wanted to plant tulip bulbs in the garden so Charles would have something beautiful to look at next spring. Charles had wanted to scream. He wanted to punch something. He wanted to demand that the universe explain why bad things happen to good people. Instead, he helped Margaret out of the car and they walked into their house together, beginning the most difficult chapter of their marriage. The next few weeks became a blur of medical appointments, insurance calls, and difficult conversations with family members. Their daughter Lisa flew in from Seattle, and their son Michael drove up from Atlanta. The grandchildren visited more often, filling the house with laughter and energy that both lifted everyone's spirits and reminded them of what they would lose. Margaret approached her illness the same way she approached everything else in life, with determination and practical planning. She organized their financial documents, updated their wills, and created detailed instructions for Charles about everything from how to work the washing machine to which neighbors could be trusted to watch the house when he traveled. Charles found himself studying his wife's face during quiet moments, trying to memorize every detail. the way she wrinkled her nose when she laughed, the small scar above her left eyebrow from when she fell off her bicycle as a child, the silver threads that had gradually replaced her auburn hair over the years. He wanted to remember everything. Margaret started sleeping more as the weeks passed. The treatments made her tired and her appetite diminished despite Charles's attempts to cook all her favorite meals. She lost more weight, and her clothes began hanging loose on her shrinking frame. But her spirit remained strong. She continued reading mystery novels, watching old movies, and insisting that Charles maintain his weekly golf game with his buddies. Friends and family visited regularly, bringing casseroles and flowers and awkward attempts at cheerful conversation. Margaret received each visitor with warmth and genuine interest in their lives. She asked about their jobs, their children, their plans. She never made anyone feel uncomfortable or sorry for her. That was Margaret's gift, making everyone around her feel special and valued. Charles noticed that Margaret had started wearing her favorite scarf more often. It was a soft blue silk scarf with tiny white flowers that he had bought for her during their anniversary trip to Paris 5 years earlier. She wore it to medical appointments, to lunch with friends, and even around the house on days when she felt too tired to get fully dressed. The scarf had become her armor, her small act of defiance against the disease that was slowly taking her away from him. The chemotherapy treatments began in October, just as the leaves started changing colors. Charles drove Margaret to every appointment, sitting beside her in the treatment center while poison dripped slowly into her veins, hoping it would kill the cancer faster than it killed the woman he loved. The irony wasn't lost on either of them. Margaret brought books to read during the long treatment sessions, but she usually ended up talking with other patients instead. Charles watched her make friends with people she might never see again, sharing stories and offering encouragement to strangers who were fighting the same battle. A young mother named Sarah was receiving treatment at the same time, and Margaret became like a surrogate grandmother to Sarah's twin boys, who sometimes came to appointments when childcare fell through. Charles learned the rhythm of the treatment schedule. Tuesday appointments meant Wednesday would be rough. Margaret would spend most of that day sleeping, and when she was awake, she felt nauseous and weak. By Friday, she would start feeling more like herself again, and they would have a few good days before the cycle repeated. Those good days became precious beyond measure. During Margaret's better days, they tried to maintain some normalcy. They went to their grandson Tommy's soccer games, where Margaret cheered loudly from the sidelines despite her weakened voice. They attended their neighbor's anniversary party, where Margaret danced slowly with Charles in the backyard under string lights. They drove to the lake where they had honeymooned all those years ago, sitting on the dock and feeding bread to the ducks while talking about their early years together. Margaret's hair started falling out after the third treatment. She had prepared for this, buying a collection of colorful headscarves and even splurging on a wig that looked remarkably like her natural hair. But most days she preferred the scarves, especially the blue one from Paris. She said wigs made her feel like she was pretending to be someone else, and she wanted to be herself for whatever time she had left. Charles struggled more with the physical changes than Margaret did. Every morning he would find strands of her hair on her pillow, and each one felt like a small death. When she finally decided to shave off what remained, Charles sat with her in the bathroom, holding her hand while the barber they had hired came to the house. Margaret cried for the first time since her diagnosis, not from vanity, but from the reality of what her changed reflection represented. The holidays that year took on special significance. Margaret insisted on hosting Thanksgiving dinner despite her family's protests. She spent weeks planning the menu and directing Charles and their children in the kitchen. She was too tired to do much of the cooking herself, but she supervised every detail, making sure the stuffing had enough sage and the cranberry sauce wasn't too sweet. 23 family members crowded into their dining room that November afternoon. Margaret sat at her usual spot at the head of the table, wearing her blue scarf and her favorite earrings, looking thin but radiant. Charles realized later that she had somehow managed to make that meal feel celebratory, rather than somber. She told funny stories about past Thanksgivings, insisted everyone share what they were grateful for, and made sure the children felt included in every conversation. After dinner, Charles found Margaret sitting alone in the garden, wrapped in a warm coat and staring at the bare flower beds. She told him she was already excited about spring, about seeing the tulip bulbs she had planted begin to grow. Charles knew she probably wouldn't live to see those flowers bloom, and he suspected she knew it too, but neither of them said anything. Hope had become something they protected carefully. Christmas preparations began earlier than usual that year. Margaret wanted to make sure all the traditional decorations were put up and that everyone received thoughtful gifts. She spent hours online, ordering presents and having them shipped to the house. She wrapped everything carefully, writing personal notes on each gift tag. Charles helped her put up the tree, but she insisted on placing every ornament herself, telling him the story behind each one as she hung it on the branches. Margaret's condition worsened after the holidays. The treatments were becoming less effective, and the side effects were taking a greater toll on her body. She started using a wheelchair for longer outings, though she still insisted on walking around the house and garden. Her appetite continued to decline, and even her favorite foods began to taste wrong to her. Dr. Martinez suggested they consider stopping the chemotherapy and focusing on comfort care. The conversation took place in late January, with snow falling outside the medical office windows. Margaret asked thoughtful questions about pain management and what to expect. Charles sat there feeling helpless, angry at the disease, angry at the treatments that weren't working, angry at himself for not being able to fix this. Margaret made the decision to stop treatment the following week. She said she wanted to spend her remaining time living rather than fighting. She wanted to be alert and present for whatever came next. Charles supported her decision, though part of him wanted to keep trying everything possible. But he had learned to trust Margaret's judgment about her own life, and he could see the relief in her eyes when she made the choice to stop. They talked openly about death for the first time that winter. Margaret told Charles what songs she wanted played at her funeral and where she wanted to be buried. She gave him detailed instructions about which jewelry should go to which family members and how she wanted her clothes donated to charity. These conversations were painful but necessary, and Charles was grateful for Margaret's practical approach to end-of-life planning. Margaret also talked about what she wanted Charles to do after she was gone. She made him promise to keep playing golf with his friends, to travel somewhere he had always wanted to visit, and to eventually consider dating again when he felt ready. Charles couldn't imagine ever being ready for any of those things, but he promised because she needed him to. The blue scarf became even more important during those final weeks. Margaret wore it every day, and Charles noticed that she often touched it absently when she was thinking or when she felt afraid. She told him that wearing it made her feel beautiful, even when she felt sick. It reminded her of their trip to Paris, of walking along the Seine River and eating croissants in sidewalk cafes. The scarf had become a tangible connection to happier times and better health. February brought an unexpected warm spell that melted the snow and coaxed early crocuses from the ground. Margaret insisted that Charles help her outside to see them, even though walking to the garden exhausted her. She sat on the old wooden bench they had bought 20 years earlier, wrapped in blankets and wearing her blue scarf, smiling at the tiny purple flowers pushing through the dark soil. Charles had taken early retirement to care for Margaret full-time. His boss had been understanding, and his co-workers had pooled their vacation days to give him additional paid leave. The gesture touched Charles deeply, though he worried about the practical matters of health insurance and retirement savings. Margaret told him not to think about money during their remaining time together, but Charles couldn't help calculating how long their savings would last if he never returned to work. Their routine became simple and precious. Charles would wake early to make coffee and bring it to Margaret in bed, along with the newspaper and any cards or letters that had arrived from friends and family. Margaret received dozens of cards each week from people she had taught with during her 30 years as an elementary school teacher. Former students, now adults with children of their own, wrote to tell her how much she had meant to them. Reading these letters became a morning ritual that often moved both Charles and Margaret to tears. Margaret spent most of her days in the living room, surrounded by photo albums and memory boxes. She was determined to organize their family history before she died, labeling pictures and writing stories on the backs of photographs. She created individual memory books for each of their grandchildren, filling them with pictures and handwritten notes about their personalities and accomplishments. Charles helped by bringing down boxes from the attic and listening to Margaret's stories about the people and events captured in faded snapshots. The house filled with flowers during those weeks. Friends brought fresh bouquets and family members sent elaborate arrangements. Margaret's favorite was a simple bunch of daisies that their 4-year-old granddaughter Emma had picked from her own yard. Margaret kept those daisies in a small vase on her bedside table until they wilted completely. refusing to throw them away because Emma had chosen each one specially for her. Margaret's pain increased during March, and they began working with a hospice team. The nurses were kind and professional, teaching Charles how to manage medications and what signs to watch for. They brought a hospital bed for the living room, so Margaret could be comfortable while still feeling part of the household activity. Charles slept on the couch beside her, waking frequently to check on her breathing and adjust her position. Their children visited more often as Margaret's condition declined. Lisa had taken a leave of absence from her job in Seattle and was staying in their guest room indefinitely. Michael drove up from Atlanta every weekend, often bringing his wife and children. The house was fuller than it had been in years, with multiple generations gathered around Margaret's bedside, sharing meals and memories. Margaret's voice grew weaker, but she still insisted on reading bedtime stories to the grandchildren when they visited. Charles would help her sit up in bed while the children gathered around her, listening to familiar fairy tales told in her increasingly fragile voice. She made Charles promise to continue the tradition after she was gone, to make sure the grandchildren always associated bedtime stories with love and comfort. The blue scarf never left Margaret's side during these weeks. She wore it during the day and slept with it at night. When she became too weak to tie it herself, Charles learned to arrange it around her shoulders the way she liked. The silk was soft against her skin, which had become sensitive to rougher fabrics. Charles noticed that Margaret's perfume had settled into the scarf's fibers, creating a gentle fragrance that surrounded her like an invisible embrace. Margaret began having more difficult days mixed with the peaceful ones. Some mornings she would wake confused about where she was or what year it was. Other days she was completely alert and wanted to discuss practical matters like funeral arrangements or what Charles should do with her craft supplies. The unpredictability was emotionally exhausting for everyone. But Charles learned to follow Margaret's lead and respond to whatever version of her was present each day. One evening in late March, Margaret asked Charles to help her write letters to their grandchildren for their future birthdays and graduations. She wanted each child to receive something from her on important occasions even after she was gone. Charles sat beside her bed, writing down her words for each grandchild, capturing her hopes and advice for their futures. The letters were funny and wise and completely Margaret, full of inside jokes and gentle guidance. Margaret's appetite disappeared almost completely during the final weeks. She could manage small sips of water and occasional spoonfuls of ice cream, but solid food became impossible. Charles learned to help her with personal care, tasks that would have embarrassed them both under different circumstances, but now felt like expressions of deep love and commitment. Margaret thanked him constantly for his care, though Charles felt like he wasn't doing nearly enough. The nights became the hardest time. Margaret often couldn't sleep, troubled by pain or anxiety or simply the strangeness of her changing body. Charles would lie beside her hospital bed, holding her hand and talking quietly about their shared memories. They remembered their wedding day, their children's births, family vacations, and ordinary moments that had taken on extraordinary significance. Sometimes Margaret would fall asleep while Charles was talking, and he would continue speaking anyway, hoping his voice provided comfort even in her dreams. Margaret's breathing became more labored as April approached. The hospice nurses explained that this was normal, that her body was beginning to shut down in preparation for death. Charles understood intellectually what was happening, but emotionally he felt unprepared for the reality of watching his wife die. He had thought he would be stronger, more capable of handling this final stage with grace and acceptance. Their last coherent conversation took place on a sunny Tuesday morning. Margaret had awakened more alert than she had been in days, and she used that clarity to tell Charles how much their marriage had meant to her. She thanked him for being a good husband and father, for supporting her dreams and forgiving her mistakes. She told him she wasn't afraid to die but was sad to leave him behind. Charles told her everything he had been wanting to say but hadn't found the words for, how proud he was of her strength, how grateful he was for their life together, how much he would miss her every day for the rest of his life. Margaret died on a Thursday morning in early April, just as the tulips she had planted in the garden were beginning to open their colorful faces to the spring sun. Charles had been sitting beside her bed, holding her hand and reading aloud from one of her favorite mystery novels, when her breathing simply stopped. The transition was so peaceful that it took him several minutes to realize she was gone. Lisa and Michael arrived within hours of Charles's phone call. They had been expecting this moment for weeks, but the reality of their mother's death still hit them like a physical blow. Charles moved through the next few hours in a strange state of calm efficiency, making necessary phone calls and greeting the hospice nurse, who came to officially pronounce Margaret's death. It wasn't until the funeral home staff arrived to take Margaret's body that Charles finally broke down, sobbing as they gently removed the blue scarf from around her shoulders. The scarf stayed with Charles during the difficult days that followed. He found himself carrying it with him around the house, sometimes holding it to his face to breathe in the faint scent of Margaret's perfume that still clung to the silk fibers. The smell transported him back to better times, Margaret getting ready for dinner parties, dabbing perfume behind her ears and asking if her outfit looked okay. The scarf had become his most tangible connection to the woman he had lost. Planning Margaret's funeral became a family project that both united and exhausted everyone. Margaret had left detailed instructions about what she wanted, but there were still dozens of decisions to make. Charles struggled with seemingly simple choices like which flowers to order and which photograph to use for the memorial program. Every decision felt monumentally important, as if getting something wrong would somehow dishonor Margaret's memory. Friends and neighbors rallied around the family with an outpouring of support that surprised Charles. Casseroles appeared on their doorstep daily. His lawn was mysteriously mowed by anonymous helpers, and cards and letters filled their mailbox. Margaret's former teaching colleagues organized a memorial fund for literacy programs in her honor. The gesture would have thrilled Margaret, who had always believed that reading could change a child's life. Charles found himself unable to sleep in their bedroom. The space felt too empty, too full of Margaret's absence. He continued sleeping on the living room couch even after the hospital bed was removed. Lisa gently suggested that he might feel better in his own bed, but Charles wasn't ready for that step. The bedroom still smelled like Margaret's perfume and contained too many reminders of their shared life. The blue scarf accompanied Charles everywhere during those pre-funeral days. He wore it draped over his shoulders while sitting in Margaret's garden, imagining conversations with her about which plants needed attention. He carried it to the grocery store, finding comfort in having something of hers close by while navigating the overwhelming task of shopping for one person instead of two. Store clerks who had known Margaret for years offered their condolences, and Charles found himself telling them about the scarf and what it meant to him. Margaret's granddaughter, Emma, now 5 years old, seemed to understand the significance of the scarf better than most adults. During one family gathering, she asked Charles if she could touch it, then solemnly declared that it still felt like Grandma Margaret. Charles later found Emma talking to the scarf, telling it about her kindergarten class and asking it to tell Grandma Margaret that she missed her. The innocence and acceptance of the child's grief helped Charles process his own complex emotions. Charles spent hours reading through the sympathy cards and letters that continued to arrive. Each one contained a story about how Margaret had touched someone's life: former students who credited her with fostering their love of learning, fellow teachers who remembered her kindness during difficult times, neighbors who appreciated her thoughtfulness and generosity. Charles began to understand that his private grief was shared by an entire community of people who had loved Margaret in their own ways. The morning of the funeral dawned gray and drizzly, matching Charles's mood perfectly. He had awakened early, unable to sleep, and found himself standing in Margaret's garden with the blue scarf wrapped around his shoulders. The tulips she had planted were in full bloom now, bright red and yellow and purple flowers that seemed almost defiant in their cheerfulness. Charles picked a small bouquet to place on Margaret's casket, remembering how excited she had been about planting those bulbs. Getting dressed for the funeral proved more difficult than Charles had anticipated. He stood in front of his closet for nearly an hour, unable to decide which tie Margaret would have chosen for him to wear. Everything felt wrong somehow, too formal or too casual, too cheerful or too somber. Finally, Lisa helped him select a navy blue tie that complemented the scarf, which Charles had decided to wear to the service despite knowing it might seem unconventional. The funeral home was packed with people from every stage of Margaret's life. Former students, some now middle-aged with children of their own, sat beside Margaret's elderly sisters and longtime neighbors. Charles was amazed by the turnout and moved by the diverse group of people who had come to honor his wife's memory. The service included readings from Margaret's favorite poems, musical selections she had chosen herself, and personal remembrances from family and friends. Charles had worried about his ability to deliver a eulogy, but when the time came, the words flowed naturally. He talked about Margaret's love of teaching, her devotion to family, and her remarkable strength during her illness. He mentioned the blue scarf and what it represented about Margaret's approach to life, her ability to find beauty even in difficult circumstances, her determination to remain herself no matter what challenges she faced. The burial service was smaller and more intimate, attended only by immediate family and closest friends. Charles stood beside the grave holding the blue scarf, listening to the minister's final prayers and the sound of dirt being scattered onto Margaret's casket. When the service ended, Charles found himself reluctant to leave. Standing there beside Margaret's grave, clutching her scarf, he felt closer to her than he had since the moment she died. The reception afterward was held at their church, with food provided by Margaret's former teaching colleagues and church friends. Charles moved through the crowd accepting condolences and sharing memories, the blue scarf still draped around his shoulders. People seemed to understand its significance without explanation, and several mourners commented on how appropriate it was that Charles would honor Margaret by wearing something so special to her. As the afternoon wore on, Charles found himself studying the faces of the people who had come to remember Margaret. Teachers she had mentored were comforting students she had taught decades earlier. Neighbors were sharing stories with relatives who lived far away. The gathering had become less about grief and more about celebration, exactly what Margaret would have wanted. Charles could almost hear her voice insisting that everyone should eat more food and stop looking so sad. The house felt impossibly quiet after everyone went home. Charles sat in the living room where Margaret's hospital bed had been, still wearing the blue scarf and staring at the empty space. Lisa and Michael had offered to stay longer, but Charles had assured them he would be fine alone. Now he wondered if he had made a mistake. The silence was overwhelming, broken only by the ticking of the grandfather clock Margaret had inherited from her mother. Charles discovered that grief was not the steady, predictable emotion he had expected. Instead, it came in waves that caught him off guard at unexpected moments. He would be fine while brushing his teeth, then suddenly overwhelmed by sadness when he realized he was only using one side of the bathroom sink. He would feel composed while making coffee, then break down when he automatically made enough for 2 people. The blue scarf became Charles's constant companion during those first weeks alone. He wore it while watching television, draped it over his shoulders while reading, and kept it on his bedside table at night. Sometimes he would catch himself talking to it as if Margaret could hear him. He would tell the scarf about his day, ask it questions about household tasks Margaret had always handled, and apologize for not taking better care of the garden. Sleep remained elusive. Charles found himself lying awake at night, listening to the house settle and remembering all the sounds Margaret had made. Her gentle snoring, the rustle of pages turning when she read in bed, the soft patting of her feet on the hardwood floors when she got up for water. The silence where those familiar sounds used to be felt louder than any noise. Charles struggled with simple daily tasks that Margaret had always managed. He burned dinner because he forgot to set the timer. He ran out of laundry detergent because he hadn't noticed they were running low. He missed paying a utility bill because Margaret had always handled their finances. Each small failure felt like evidence that he couldn't survive without her. That half of his competence had died with his wife. Well-meaning friends and family members called regularly to check on Charles, but he found these conversations exhausting. Everyone wanted to know how he was doing, but Charles didn't know how to answer that question. How was he supposed to be doing? Some days he felt numb, other days angry, occasionally almost normal before remembering that Margaret was gone, and feeling guilty for having a moment of peace. The mailbox continued to bring sympathy cards and letters weeks after the funeral. Charles read each one carefully, often while holding the blue scarf. Some contained checks for the memorial fund established in Margaret's honor. Others included photographs or memories from people whose lives Margaret had touched. Charles began keeping these letters in a special box, thinking he might read them again when his grief felt less raw. Margaret's garden demanded attention as spring progressed. Charles had never been much of a gardener, but he felt obligated to maintain what Margaret had created. He bought gardening books and tried to remember her instructions about watering and fertilizing. The blue scarf accompanied him outside during these efforts, draped around his neck as he awkwardly attempted to weed flower beds and prune bushes. One morning, Charles found himself standing in the garden holding the scarf to his face, breathing in the faint scent of Margaret's perfume and crying harder than he had since the day she died. The neighbor's wife, Mrs. Peterson, saw him from her kitchen window and came outside to check on him. She sat with Charles on the garden bench, not saying much, just providing the comfort of human presence while he grieved. Mrs. Peterson's visit marked the beginning of a gradual reintegration with the outside world. She invited Charles for dinner the following week, insisting that he needed to eat better than whatever he was managing to cook for himself. Charles accepted reluctantly, bringing the blue scarf with him and explaining its significance to the Petersons. They understood completely, Mrs. Peterson sharing that she still wore her late mother's wedding ring 20 years after her death. Charles's golf buddies made persistent efforts to get him back on the course. He had been a regular player for 15 years, but the idea of returning to normal activities felt like a betrayal of Margaret's memory. Finally, after weeks of gentle pressure, Charles agreed to play 9 holes on a quiet Tuesday morning. He wore the blue scarf under his golf shirt, finding that having Margaret close to him made the outing bearable. The routine of golf helped more than Charles had expected. The physical activity felt good after weeks of sitting around the house. The familiar banter with his friends provided a brief escape from the constant weight of grief. Charles discovered that he could laugh at their jokes without feeling guilty, that moments of normalcy didn't diminish his love for Margaret or minimize his loss. Charles began venturing out for other activities as spring turned to summer. He attended his grandson's Little League games where Margaret's absence felt particularly acute. She had never missed Tommy's games, always cheering loudly from the bleachers and bringing homemade cookies for the team. Charles brought store-bought cookies and cheered more quietly, but Tommy seemed grateful for his presence regardless. The blue scarf drew questions and comments wherever Charles went. Some people found it odd that a man would wear a woman's scarf, but Charles had stopped caring about social conventions. When people asked about it, he would explain that it had belonged to his late wife and brought him comfort. Most people understood and shared their own stories about keeping mementos of lost loved ones. Charles started a journal during this period, writing letters to Margaret that he knew she would never read. He told her about his struggles with daily life, his attempts to maintain her garden, and the kindness of friends and neighbors. Writing these letters felt like maintaining a connection with Margaret, even though he knew the communication was one-sided. Sometimes he would write while holding the blue scarf, imagining that Margaret was listening to his words. The scarf's perfume began to fade as the months passed, causing Charles considerable distress. The scent had been his strongest sensory connection to Margaret, and losing it felt like losing her again. He considered having the scarf professionally preserved or sealed in a container, but ultimately decided that would change its essential nature. Instead, he accepted that the fading fragrance was part of his journey through grief. Summer brought new challenges as Charles faced his first birthday without Margaret. She had always made his birthdays special, planning surprise parties or intimate dinners and always giving thoughtful gifts that showed how well she knew him. This year, his children called and sent cards and neighbors brought over a cake, but the day felt empty without Margaret's special touch. Charles spent part of the day sitting in her garden, wearing the blue scarf and talking to her about how much he missed her celebrations. Charles began attending a grief support group at the recommendation of his doctor. Initially skeptical about sharing his private pain with strangers, he found unexpected comfort in hearing other people's stories of loss. The group included widows and widowers of various ages, all struggling with similar challenges of rebuilding life after losing a spouse. Charles brought the blue scarf to meetings, and other group members shared their own special mementos and rituals for staying connected to their lost partners. The first anniversary of Margaret's diagnosis arrived in September, bringing with it a flood of difficult memories. Charles found himself reliving every moment of that terrible day in Dr. Martinez's office, remembering the shock and fear that had changed their lives forever. He wore the blue scarf constantly during this period, sometimes layering it under other clothes so he could feel it against his skin throughout the day. Charles had been seeing a grief counselor for several months, a kind woman named Dr. Sarah Chen, who helped him understand that his feelings were normal and that healing didn't mean forgetting Margaret. Dr. Chen encouraged Charles to find ways to honor Margaret's memory while also building a new life for himself. The blue scarf, she suggested, could be part of that process, a bridge between his past with Margaret and his future without her. The support group had become an important part of Charles's routine. He looked forward to the weekly meetings where he could share his struggles and victories with people who truly understood his experience. Several group members had become genuine friends, people he could call when the loneliness felt overwhelming or when he needed practical advice about living alone. One evening after group, Charles was having coffee with Helen, a widow who had lost her husband 2 years earlier. She mentioned that she was planning a trip to Italy, something she and her husband had always wanted to do together. Charles was amazed by her courage, and Helen explained that she had finally realized her husband would want her to see the world, not sit at home mourning him forever. This conversation planted a seed in Charles's mind about the trip to Ireland that he and Margaret had planned but never taken. Margaret's birthday in October proved to be another emotional milestone. Charles spent the morning at her grave, bringing fresh flowers and sitting quietly beside her headstone while wearing the blue scarf. He told her about the changes in the garden, the grandchildren's latest accomplishments, and how much he still missed her every day. Later, he went to their favorite restaurant and ordered Margaret's usual meal. Feeling both sad and comforted by the familiar ritual, Charles began to notice that his relationship with the blue scarf was evolving. In the early months after Margaret's death, he had clung to it desperately, needing its physical presence to feel connected to her. Now, while still precious to him, the scarf felt more like a beloved friend than a lifeline. He could go a few hours without touching it, and sometimes he would forget he was wearing it until someone commented on it. The approaching holidays filled Charles with dread. Margaret had always loved Christmas, spending weeks decorating the house and planning elaborate meals for their extended family. Charles couldn't imagine celebrating without her, but his children and grandchildren needed some sense of normalcy. He decided to host a simplified version of their traditional Christmas dinner, asking family members to help with cooking and decorating. Preparing for Christmas without Margaret was emotionally exhausting, but it also provided Charles with a sense of purpose he had been missing. He found Margaret's carefully organized boxes of decorations in the attic, each ornament wrapped in tissue paper and labeled in her neat handwriting. Hanging these familiar decorations while wearing the blue scarf felt like including Margaret in the preparations. Even though she wasn't physically present, the Christmas dinner was smaller than in previous years but warm and meaningful. Charles's children and grandchildren gathered around the table where Margaret had presided for so many years, sharing memories and continuing traditions she had established. Charles wore the blue scarf throughout the day, and several family members commented on how right it seemed to have that piece of Margaret present for their celebration. As winter deepened, Charles began planning the trip to Ireland that he and Margaret had dreamed about. She had always wanted to see the countryside where her grandmother had been born, and Charles decided to make that journey for both of them. He would bring the blue scarf with him, carrying Margaret's spirit to the places she had wanted to explore. Planning the trip gave Charles something positive to focus on during the dark months of his second winter without Margaret. He researched hotels and restaurants, mapped out driving routes, and learned about the history of the regions he planned to visit. The blue scarf sat on his desk while he worked on these plans, a constant reminder that this journey was as much about honoring Margaret as it was about moving forward with his own life. Charles surprised himself by feeling excited about traveling. For months he had wondered if he would ever feel enthusiastic about anything again. The prospect of seeing new places and having new experiences while carrying Margaret's memory with him felt like a healthy step forward in his grief journey. The Ireland trip took place in early spring, almost exactly 1 year after Margaret's death. Charles packed the blue scarf carefully in his carry-on bag, making sure it would be with him throughout the journey. Flying alone felt strange after decades of traveling with Margaret, but Charles found that talking to other passengers helped pass the time and eased his nervousness about navigating foreign airports and rental cars by himself. Ireland exceeded Charles's expectations in every way. The countryside was as beautiful as Margaret had imagined, with rolling green hills dotted with sheep and ancient stone walls stretching to the horizon. Charles visited the small village where Margaret's grandmother had been born, walking through the cemetery and photographing the church where she had been baptized. He wore the blue scarf during these explorations, feeling Margaret's presence more strongly than he had since her death. On his last day in Ireland, Charles climbed a hill overlooking the Atlantic Ocean and sat for hours watching waves crash against the rocky coast. He held the blue scarf in his hands, thinking about Margaret and their life together, feeling grateful for their years of happiness while also acknowledging his readiness to move forward. The ocean breeze carried the faint scent of Margaret's perfume from the scarf's fibers, a final gift from the woman he would always love. Charles returned from Ireland with a renewed sense of purpose and possibility. The trip had shown him that he could create new memories and experiences while still honoring Margaret's influence on his life. The blue scarf had been his companion throughout the journey, but he no longer felt dependent on it for emotional survival. Instead, it had become a beautiful reminder of love that transcends death. Back home, Charles began making other changes in his life. He signed up for cooking classes, something Margaret had always encouraged him to do. He volunteered at the literacy program established in Margaret's honor, reading to children and helping with fundraising events. He even started dating occasionally, meeting women through friends and community activities, though he was careful to explain the significance of the blue scarf to anyone who might become important in his life. 2 years after Margaret's death, Charles found himself in a place he never could have imagined during those dark early months of grief. He had rebuilt his life around new routines and relationships, while still maintaining meaningful connections to Margaret's memory. The blue scarf remained important to him, but it no longer defined his daily existence or emotional well-being. Charles had become a regular volunteer at the elementary school where Margaret had taught for 30 years. The current teachers welcomed his help with reading programs and special events, and Charles enjoyed sharing stories about Margaret with colleagues who had worked with her. The children called him Mr. Charles and seemed fascinated by the blue scarf, which he wore during school visits. He would tell them it had belonged to his wife, who had been a teacher just like theirs, and that wearing it helped him remember how much she had loved working with children. The grief support group had evolved into a social circle of close friends who supported each other through various life challenges beyond loss. Charles had become something of a mentor to newly grieving members, sharing his experience and offering hope that healing was possible. He always brought the blue scarf to meetings, using it as a tangible example of how mementos could provide comfort without becoming crutches. Margaret's garden had flourished under Charles's gradually improving care. He had taken several gardening courses and consulted frequently with knowledgeable neighbors, slowly learning to maintain and even expand what Margaret had created. The tulips she had planted bloomed faithfully each spring, joined by new varieties that Charles selected with her preferences in mind. He often worked in the garden while wearing the blue scarf, feeling Margaret's approval for his efforts to honor her green thumb. Charles's relationship with his children and grandchildren had deepened during his grief journey. His vulnerability and openness about missing Margaret had created space for more honest and intimate family connections. The grandchildren, now older and more aware of death's reality, often asked Charles about their grandmother and seemed to find comfort in his stories and his willingness to share his emotions. The blue scarf had become part of family mythology, a symbol of enduring love that the children would remember throughout their lives. Dating had been one of the most challenging aspects of Charles's new life. He felt guilty about enjoying female companionship and worried about betraying Margaret's memory. His grief counselor and support group friends helped him understand that loving someone new didn't diminish his love for Margaret, but translating that intellectual understanding into emotional acceptance took time. Charles was always upfront about the blue scarf's significance, and he found that women who couldn't accept its importance in his life weren't right for him anyway. Eventually, Charles met Eleanor, a widow who understood the complexity of loving again after loss. She had her own mementos from her late husband and never asked Charles to put away the blue scarf or stop talking about Margaret. Instead, she encouraged him to share memories and included Margaret in their conversations naturally. Eleanor's acceptance of Charles's past freed him to fully engage with their developing relationship. The 3rd anniversary of Margaret's death marked another turning point for Charles. He still visited her grave regularly and thought about her daily, but the sharp edge of grief had softened into a gentle sadness, mixed with gratitude for their years together. The blue scarf remained precious to him, but he found that he could leave it at home sometimes without feeling anxious or disconnected from Margaret's memory. Charles decided to write a book about his grief journey, hoping to help other people facing similar losses. He wrote about the blue scarf and its role in his healing, describing how physical mementos could provide comfort while also acknowledging the danger of becoming too dependent on them. The book included practical advice about daily life after loss, the importance of professional support, and the possibility of finding joy again after devastating grief. Publishing the book connected Charles with other widowed people around the country who reached out to share their own stories and gratitude for his honesty about the grief process. He began speaking at conferences and workshops, always wearing the blue scarf and explaining its significance to his healing journey. These speaking engagements gave Charles a sense of purpose and helped him feel that Margaret's death had meaning beyond their personal loss. Eleanor gradually became a central part of Charles's life, though he never stopped loving Margaret or honoring her memory. The two women had never met, but Charles felt sure they would have liked each other. Eleanor understood that Margaret would always hold a special place in Charles's heart, just as her late husband remained important to her. Their relationship was built on acceptance of the past and hope for the future. Charles and Eleanor married in a small ceremony 5 years after Margaret's death. Charles wore the blue scarf during the wedding, and Eleanor's late husband's watch was incorporated into her bouquet. Both families understood that this marriage wasn't about replacing what had been lost, but about creating something new, while honoring what had come before. The ceremony included readings about enduring love and the ways that death cannot break the bonds between people who truly care for each other. The blue scarf found a new role in Charles's married life with Eleanor. It became a bridge between his past and present, a way of including Margaret in their home without making Eleanor feel like a replacement. Eleanor often admired the scarf's beauty and asked Charles to tell her stories about the trip to Paris where he had bought it. The scarf served as a conversation starter for sharing memories and keeping Margaret's spirit alive in healthy ways. Charles's grandchildren grew up knowing about both Grandpa Charles's first wife Margaret and his second wife Eleanor. The blue scarf helped them understand that people could love more than one person in a lifetime, and that new love didn't erase previous love. As they matured, the grandchildren came to see Charles's journey through grief and into new love as a powerful example of resilience and the human capacity for healing. On quiet evenings, Charles would sometimes sit in Margaret's garden wearing the blue scarf, remembering their life together while feeling grateful for the unexpected second chance at happiness he had found with Eleanor. The scarf still carried the faintest trace of Margaret's perfume, a whisper of the woman who had taught him about love's enduring power. Margaret was gone, but the love they had shared continued to enrich Charles's life in ways he never could have imagined during those dark days of early grief. The blue scarf had become more than a memento. It was a symbol of love's ability to transcend death, of the possibility of healing after devastating loss, and of the human capacity to honor the past while embracing the future. Charles would carry it with him for the rest of his life, a beautiful reminder that true love never really ends. It simply transforms into new ways of being present in the world.